You are listening to the Foreign Policy Focus podcast.
We cannot wait for the final proof. The smoking gun could come in the form of a mushroom cloud.
Haven't you driven enough people from their homes already? Bulldoze their villages, seize their property and their laws. They had no part in making it.
Now working in Libya with friends and allies, we've demonstrated what collective action can achieve in the 21st century.
Now the host of the show, Kyle Inslee.
This is episode 472 of the Foreign Policy Focus podcast, and it's Monday, so that means Will Porter is joining me. He's a staff writer over at RT, and, every week we get, treated to him coming on and talking about all the stuff he's been writing in the past week and just all the, kind of current news stories that are going on and some looking forward and what might happen in this week ahead. So, Will, welcome back to the show.
Thanks for having me, Kyle. How you doing?
I'm, it's interesting times that we're living in. I guess that's, the one thing we need to highlight here is that I think most of us have been under some form of quarantine, shelter in place. The definition of essential employee is fairly vague. And so there's still a lot of people that are heading into work every day. But there's an awful lot of people who haven't left their house very much in the past 2 weeks. And, that's not something that happens a whole lot. And certainly we'll be talking about the coronavirus a little bit on today's show as we have been updating it, every week. But I want to start off by talking with you about Afghanistan today and just the, progress of the peace talks with the quote unquote peace agreement that we have with the Taliban. And, this was supposed to kind of facilitate a workable solution going forward between the Taliban and the Afghan government. And just tell me, what are some news stories we've had out of Afghanistan the past week?
Yeah, so last week, the Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, this is one of the larger developments lately in terms of the U.S.'s relationship with Afghanistan and sort of the state of the peace deal, or the deal, I guess we should say, the withdrawal deal. So Pompeo went to Kabul this week. He visited there to try to patch together this deal to make sure it doesn't implode, because a lot of it is relying on sort of the Kabul government's relations with the Taliban and what they're going to be doing. And so, as you've covered plenty of times on this show, Washington's deal with the Taliban entails this prisoner exchange between the Taliban and the Kabul government. But the U.S. kind of went ahead with this provision of the deal without really getting without really making sure that the Afghan government was going to go through with this. And the Afghan government has been very reluctant to do this and mostly, kind of opposed to even dealing with the Taliban at all, at least reluctant to do so. And all of this is happening. All this stuff with the deal is also happening during this pretty intense dispute and standoff between these two leaders in Afghanistan over who should rule the government, who should be in control. And so their last election in September was decided in favor of Ashraf Ghani, the incumbent. But another guy named Abdullah, who used to be basically the co-president of Afghanistan, the chief executive officer, the CEO of Afghanistan, this Abdullah guy says that he actually won the election and that Ghani had cheated. And so both are claiming victory, both held a dueling inauguration ceremonies, all this stuff. It's a real dispute between these two guys over who should control the state. And so Pompeo went to Afghanistan on Monday to try to sort of patch things up between Ghani and Abdullah, to try to get them to form a unity government without, contesting each other's legitimacy. But he failed to do so. Pompeo was unable to get them to agree. Abdullah has apparently been offered a top position within Ghani's cabinet, and he's refused it, I guess. And he's now demanding, or I think he's still demanding changes to the Afghan constitution. And he's right now trying to set up a parallel administration in, I think, a building right next door to the official presidential compound. So it's all kind of bizarre, this dispute between these two guys. But
I just want to add that Pompeo publicly put out that he was frustrated with the situation in Kabul. And so I thought that was significant that, the Secretary of State actually says that. And I'm sure, he did so, knowing that the two people claiming to run Afghanistan would hear that. And then I just want to add that I read in an article, I believe in the New York Times, that the situation in Kabul is extremely intense. As you pointed out, these two, Abdullah and Ghani have, kind of their administrations and presidential offices set up fairly close to each other, and they both have armed guards. This is Afghanistan, and so it's a very tense situation in a potential tinderbox, and it's going to be hard to say what comes out of this, especially if people in Afghanistan start to get coronavirus. What happens? A lot of question marks here, and I just have to say that this election absolutely shows the failure of the American nation building effort in Afghanistan. The fact that you had an election that happened in September is disputed all the way. Both men initially declared themselves victor, continued to declare themselves victor. The margin of victory was super narrow, and it's just a huge mess. So anyways, that's kind of where I was, but go on with the recent news, Will.
Yeah, exactly. So you put it well, like you framed the dispute between these two guys well. And so Pompeo went over there on Monday to try to patch things up, and he failed. He couldn't get them to agree on a unity government. And so in response to that, Washington has now cut $1 billion from the foreign aid that basically props up the Afghan government. I forget exactly how much it was supposed to be for 2020, some number of billions, but they chopped $1 billion off of it. And then they've now threatened to cut another $1 billion too off of the next year's foreign aid package if they still can't sort things out by them. And you had actually just informed me of an even more recent update. But on Friday, the Ghani government was saying that they had put together this team that they were going to try to go forward with talks with the Taliban. At the time, it wasn't really clear if Abdullah had endorsed that. But some of the reporting was saying, some anonymous diplomats and allies of Abdullah were saying that, yeah, he'll probably back this. But I think now that the Taliban has come out and said, no, we're not going to go through with these talks. And so for a minute, it was looking as if the government was trying to pull things together a little bit in Kabul, trying to go forward with some negotiations with the Taliban. But now that there might be a roadblock in front of that. But either way, though, fortunately, none of this has seemed to put any roadblocks in front of the American drawdown or the withdrawal from Afghanistan. And so that still seems to be happening, at the same rate, despite all of this dispute between these two rulers in Afghanistan, these two leaders. And on Monday, Pompeo also flew to Doha in Qatar and met with the Taliban negotiator there, after he left Kabul. And after that, he had actually said that the Taliban was largely holding to their end of the agreement and they're not attacking American forces. And so it doesn't look like the U.S. is going to try to exploit this dispute between Ghani and Abdullah as a reason to stay longer or to complicate the situation. It sounds like they're going to pull out regardless. And so at least for the time being, I guess that's a good thing.
All right. Well, I guess it's kind of hard to say going forward. Will, what you think will happen in Afghanistan, but. Is there any sign of light between Ghani and Abdullah and I guess from the position negotiating with the Taliban, obviously these two men being unable to reconcile enough to form an administration means they have fairly different political positions, and with that would mean they would want to work out fairly different agreements with the Taliban, I would assume. As far as the individual details go, what's important, what you're willing to compromise on or not. And so is there a way to a resolution here, or is it just going to be the U.S. threatening to cut aid? And then I don't know, maybe, yeah, we talk about this now too. Just to mention that I think some people see this cutting of aid and they're like, oh no, we're cutting aid in the wake of the coronavirus, how dangerous. But just how much of this aid is actually going to something useful and how much of it is being, just corruptly stolen?
Well, yeah, I mean, Afghanistan is among one of the most corrupt countries on earth, and that government in Kabul, it largely just lives off of our government welfare. And so I tend to think quite a bit of that is probably pocketed by officials on all kinds of different levels at the top and, maybe even on the more local level too, how it's distributed around the country or whatever. And so, I would hope that they could find, enough, in their pockets, maybe enough that they're, taking off the top that they could still, combat the virus, I guess. And I know the Taliban, too, I'd read they're sending around their own health teams to try to spread awareness about the virus and stuff. So I guess they're also concerned about it. But in terms of how, the dispute between Ghani and Abdullah, it did seem like I was saying after the U.S. had cut aid and threatened to cut more. it seemed as if like that had immediately produced some some of the reporting was saying that Abdullah was likely to sign on to the team that Ghani had put together to negotiate with the Taliban. So it seemed there was some indication that maybe he hadn't come out publicly and said like, yeah, I back this or anything. But I think the Times had talked to one of his allies, one of his like confidants, and like he said he's likely to come out and back it. Now that's kind of moot because the Taliban have said like they're not going to go through with those talks. But in terms of just like the relationship between Ghani and Abdullah, it did look like they were maybe started to come together a little bit. But I guess it's hard to say. Like there's a pretty intense dispute between the two, so I think it's going to be pretty difficult to like resolve that. I don't know if even cutting $1 billion will accomplish that alone.
All right. Well, I want to talk to you now about Iraq, where over the past week I've seen some headlines, and there's not much news that makes it through the coronavirus tidal wave, but I did see some stories about troop movements in Iraq between American allies and, some American troops being repositioned. So can you give us a little bit of details on what's going on there?
Yeah. So there have been like quite a few smaller, similar developments in Iraq lately, and it's indirectly related to the coronavirus. So like that is, it's still part of that tidal wave, as you said. But last Wednesday, we had the French military saying they're going to be pulling out all of their troops from the country, at least all their ground troops, which I think is only like 100 guys. Part of their operation, I think, is called Chamal or Kamal. For a while, it's funny. The French actually had insisted that they had no boots on the ground as part of this operation, but like clearly that's not the case by their own admission now that they're pulling out guys. There had to be guys there in the first place. And they say they're going to continue flying airstrikes against the Islamic State in Iraq. But I'm not really sure how busy the French have been with that lately, or like how, whether they're still right now flying a lot of air raids at all. So like, it's also not clear how many personnel that's going to require, how many they're going to have to keep there to keep flying these airstrikes. But at least they've said they've now removed all of their ground troops. And actually, these French soldiers might now actually be redeployed within France, within France's own borders, because now they've deployed troops within their own streets to help to enforce the lockdown measures and the quarantines and stuff. And we also had the United Kingdom a few weeks ago doing a similar thing. They didn't pull out. I think they have like 400 soldiers in Iraq, and most of them are, as far as I understand, related to like training Iraqi forces. But they did say they've withdrawn everyone who's not a key military personnel. So like that's, I don't think they actually gave a number for how many troops they pulled out, but they also had a significant drawdown in Iraq because of the virus. And just like France, the UK has also now put 10,000 soldiers on standby to deploy within their own borders for a similar reason, to help fight the pandemic or administer public services and stuff. And so the UK has sort of done the same thing as France in consolidating their forces. Now, we also had earlier this month, we had the U.S. declaring that they were going to be making some changes in Iraq, too, also because of the coronavirus. But they didn't actually, the U.S. stopped short of an actual withdrawal. So instead, they've just like repositioned troops within Iraq, and they've pulled them from smaller bases. There was one base by Mosul, and there's one base out by the Syrian border, where they pulled these soldiers out and they consolidated them at larger bases. And they've stopped all the training mission too. So all the trainers have now, ceased doing that. And so, we've seen these major U.S. allies. I think the Czech military also pulled they had a few guys there. They pulled them out. So the virus, we've really seen like it's forced some withdrawals, especially in Iraq. And it's done all kinds of things to the military, which we'll get to at some point. But yeah, this week we had the French pulling out. Last week, the week prior, we had the UK, and then I think even the week before that, we had the US repositioning.
Well, I don't know how many French libertarians there are, but I'm sure there are some, and I'm sure however you say bring the troops home in French, they have some kind of saying that, is generally along that. And what a sick joke it's played on them, that you finally bring the troops home, but it's only to redeploy them on your own streets. So just to clarify, that anytime me and Will say bring the troops home, we're not talking about this kind of insanity where you would, then deploy those troops in the U.S. Now, somebody pointed out to me that like sometimes deploying a troop in the U.S. means like sending an army medic to work at a local hospital, in which case like that is a completely different situation. But we're I think here talking about a bunch of soldiers coming back from Iraq. My guess is there's a whole lot of guys whose main job it is to stand around with a rifle versus, healing in putting ventilators on people and everything else. So I don't know if you have anything else to add there, Will.
Well, yeah, I was just going to say in France, they're definitely doing more than just having medics, build hospitals or go and work in hospitals. They have soldiers and gendarmes patrolling the streets, making sure people aren't out, when they're not supposed to be. So, yeah, certainly not what we mean when we say bring the troops home. We don't mean come deploy them here in a militarized capacity by any means.
So, one aspect of the coronavirus, and the one that obviously applies most to this show, is how it impacts U.S. foreign policy. And Will, today I wanted to talk to you about that on maybe a tactical, strategic and logistical level. Not our idea that the coronavirus is just a sign that we can't sustain this empire and we need to come home. There's no sense in having U.S. troops over there, and stuff like that. But just what is happening? What is the U.S. military doing in reaction? How is it going from what we know? Are troops moving around? Is everything being canceled? Are troops being sent home? Are they, being called? Are reservists being called up? Who knows what direction it could go? It kind of, I would guess they would want more troops on hand, but at the same time, maybe in a more practical and just workable sense, it would actually be better to send everybody home so that they're not in the barracks together. But I don't know. Let me know what's happening.
Yeah. So there's all kinds of stuff that's happened just in the last couple of weeks in terms of how this virus has been impacting the military, the U.S. military. We've just kind of hit on that a little bit in terms of how it's forced a repositioning within Iraq. But yeah, there's a real long list of stuff that's happened in the last couple of weeks that show how much this virus is impacting the military. And so I guess let's just start with the Navy. So this week, or last week, I should say, we've had a few different cases of infected sailors on Navy ships, but last week we had the first cases of the virus on a deployed Navy vessel, which is the USS Theodore Roosevelt. And this is an aircraft carrier that at the time when they first detected this was parked out by the Philippines. And they ended up finding 36 guys on board with the illness, and it basically took the ship out of commission. They had to sail it to Guam, and where they were going to test all 5,000 sailors on board. And I'm not totally sure if they put out the results of that yet. It might be that the 36 were the total from the 5,000, but they may have found more after testing them all at Guam. I'm not exactly sure if they put that information out. And so, we've already seen this started to affect the Navy. Prior to this, you had infections on 3 other Navy ships. None of those were deployed, though. Those were all sitting off the West Coast here in the U.S. But you had the USS Boxer, amphibious assault ship. You had the littoral combat ship, the USS Colorado. Both of those are in California right now, sitting off the coast. And then you also had the USS Ralph Johnson, which is a guided missile destroyer near Washington, parked in the coast near Washington State. You had all 3 of these ships have, infections on board. And so they've had to sort of adopt what I think they call aggressive mitigation strategies and, trying to prevent these things from spreading. Because, as we've seen with some of these cruise ships, being out on a floating vessel, I don't know, that's a very small, cramped quarters to be in. You're crammed in with thousands of other people, and so this could very quickly take vessels out of commission, as we already saw with the aircraft carrier, the Theodore Roosevelt. We can see how fast this can become a giant issue on board one of these vessels. So the Navy has already started to. Oh, go ahead.
And just to jump in for a second. Apparently, during the first couple of years of the Trump administration, Mattis really wanted to have a 2 aircraft carrier policy in the Persian Gulf, Middle East region, and that put a lot of strain on the U.S. aircraft carrier maintenance cycle. And apparently, we just now have sent a second aircraft carrier to the Middle East. So just to understand that while we have an absurd amount of aircraft carriers and definitely more than we need. It does seem like we could eventually feel the strain if 2 or 3 of these ships have a significant outbreak and, for some amount of time are unable to do whatever the U.S. military wants them to do.
Yeah. I mean, once this thing pops up on one of these vessels, it's hard to put the genie back in the bottle. It's really easy for it to spread all around. Everyone's sharing. It's pretty cramped quarters. And especially on submarines and stuff too, it'd be even worse to try to prevent the spread once an outbreak already starts on one of these ships. So yeah, we've already seen the Navy start to have some pretty significant effects on their operations, just in terms of these ships have to take all these extra precautions. The aircraft carrier had to divert its whole mission and stop in Guam. So we could, certainly we may see more of that with the Navy. Now, in terms of the Air Force, there's been a bunch of air bases all around the U.S. I think like at least 8 of them that I counted up the other day. There's some in California and Florida, Arkansas, Colorado, Montana, Illinois, Maryland. There's probably even more by now. This thing is growing so rapidly. But all these air bases have gone on high alert or like declared a state of emergency. In some of these cases, it's because airmen on the actual base tested positive for the virus. In others, it's just because the community nearby had a big outbreak in the civilian population. But we're seeing all these air bases get put on high alert and sort of have to change their operations, restrict access to the bases. And at one base in California, Edwards Air Force Base, which the Air Force uses as like one of its major testing facilities, the military has now called off all flight testing for the F-35, which we've talked about a lot on the show, the Joint Strike Fighter, which is like plagued by endless problems. And now they're still apparently going to be running software tests on the F-35, which don't require it to actually fly or anything. And these software tests keep revealing hundreds of errors. Like I think one recent test found 800 software glitches in the F-35 still. Things they still have not worked out even after pouring billions and billions of dollars into this aircraft, of tax dollars, I should say. But for now, they've paused the testing for the F-35 indefinitely. And so we're seeing the virus also have some pretty severe effects on these air bases and the actual testing of the F-35. Let's see here. There's also
I just want to say that I've already seen this. People are writing there's like articles at Bloomberg about how this the F-35 supply chain will be affected or something. And my guess is in a year when Lockheed Martin is in front of Congress, they're going to say, well, the unpredictable coronavirus caused this thing was a piece of crap long before the coronavirus came along. And so I don't know. I think it's just going to kind of be like the U.S. economy where it had a ton of problems and it was just had so much rot in it. And then the coronavirus came along. That's what popped the bubble. Okay. But that's not the reason for the ultimate crash and the problems that we're going to see in the economy in the future. I think same thing. You're going to see the same narrative coming out of the government with a lot of other projects, including the F-35 and maybe also the Ford class of aircraft carrier, which has numerous problems. It really isn't battle ready.
Yeah. I mean, the F-35's problems go way before they've been having all kinds of cost overruns and delays. And I think the test that had found this 800 software glitches in the F-35, I think that was prior to the virus even being a thing in the U.S. It might have been when it was still in China only, but this stuff goes way before the virus. That's just going to be their excuse now, of course. So yeah, like the F-35 has been put on hold, the testing process, and so that could delay the entire project even more than it's already been delayed. But in terms of just like more broad effects on the military, the Pentagon was forced to restrict access to itself, to like the building itself, to such an extent that like 60% of its 22,000 employees are now working from home. So like this is probably going to put a lot of sand in the gears of the Pentagon, which is already a giant, slow bureaucracy, cumbersome bureaucracy. But now we're seeing, people being furloughed and being sent home to work from their PCs at home. I'm sure there's all kinds of issues with like classified material where people can't actually work from home. I know that's certainly the case at some other military facilities. But the defense secretary ordered the restrictions in the Pentagon after it was found that an airman and an Air Force contractor had gotten the virus and then were allowed inside the building, in early March. And then a little later, too, there was a Marine who had been in the building who was found to have the virus, too. And so, after these people who were infected got inside the building, they've really now clamped down on who can come and go from the Pentagon itself. And so far, altogether, more than 650 soldiers, contractors, and civilian DoD staffers have tested positive for the virus. And that was just the latest figure I'd seen. It might be more by now. A lot of the time, these figures grow super fast nowadays. They jump and double, and it's pretty quick. But of those 650, 2 of those guys have died now from this virus. And I know there's also questions about how they're counting the fatalities. Sometimes people die from other causes, but they have the virus, so they count them. I'm not totally sure if that's the case for either of these 2 soldiers or contractors who've died so far. But large groups of soldiers are now also in isolation. They had 2,600 EUCOM soldiers over there in Europe. They had to put them in quarantine after 35 European or American soldiers stationed in Europe tested positive for the virus. And Esper has actually put a halt on all major troop movements worldwide. And so not only do you have these like several thousand quarantine troops out there in Europe, but you also just have like a total halt on all major troop movements, with an exception on the Afghanistan withdrawal. Like that is they're making a exception for that. So they're allowing the troops to still leave from there. But otherwise, people are pretty much been frozen in place. Now there might be other exceptions for this too, with certain troop movements, but in general, they're urging they're trying to stop all troop movements around the world to try to prevent the spread of this virus, obviously, because you have some soldiers who are stationed in countries where it's not as bad, and you have soldiers stationed in countries where it is really bad. Like now in Europe, you have several NATO countries that are really hit hard by this virus. And speaking of Europe, too, the U.S. has now recalled 20,000 soldiers who were supposed to participate in NATO's Defender Europe 2020 War Games exercise, which was supposed to involve like 37,000 soldiers from 18 NATO countries. And it was scheduled to initially go from April to May. And it was supposed to be like the biggest NATO exercise they've done in like 25 years. And so now they've pretty much called this off effectively. The Pentagon still says they're going to do some like scaled back version of this exercise or this drill, but I don't think they've revealed much detail about like, what that's actually going to look like, how many soldiers will actually participate.
And my understanding was that wasn't necessarily a very decisive or well handled, drawback on that. And a lot of U.S. soldiers had actually like kind of already rotate into Europe for this, and then it was, as you said, drawn back. I also read that Russia canceled their corresponding war games.
Yeah, we also canceled. There was a war game we're supposed to do with South Korea that we've. I don't think they outright canceled it. They just said they've postponed it, but they've not said when they're actually going to do it or what this is actually going to look like. Because I don't think anyone really knows how long this pandemic is going to go on. And so, we've had all these war games called off, and that the Defender Europe 2020 was supposed to be a gigantic one. It was going to span like 6 European countries, exercises being done in 6 different countries. And so, yeah, we've seen some real effects on the operation of our military overseas and somewhat at home too, with some of those Navy ships stationed here and some of the Air Force bases. But much more concerning, I think, is like some of the other things happening here in the U.S. in terms of the military. They're starting to deploy soldiers on American soil right now. As we've sort of discussed, France is doing, Italy has done, and of course China did to a pretty extreme extent in terms of straight up blocking roads and putting soldiers at train stations and stuff. And so it's not quite got that bad here in the U.S. yet, but right now they've got the National Guard, they've got the Navy, and they have the Army doing things on American soil, the Army Corps of Engineers. And so the Navy has sent 2 medical ships to New York and California, where they're supposed to be, they have each have 1,000 beds on them, and they're supposed to be treating non-coronavirus patients, so they can try to take some of the pressure off of the actual hospitals and make some room. You also have the Army Corps of Engineers. They're right now looking at 100 facilities across states like New York and California and Washington. They're looking at facilities to convert into hospitals and quarantine centers. And like I said, it's in some of the larger, New York, California, and Washington have some of the larger clusters of the virus in the U.S. So they're looking at those states. They're already doing things in those states. But then there was a Reuters report on Saturday that was saying the Pentagon is now looking at Chicago, Michigan, Florida, and Louisiana as places they might deploy next, where the Army is supposed to go in and build more field hospitals, the Army Corps of Engineers. And so you have quite a bit of military activity here. You have the governors have called up 10,000 National Guardsmen across a bunch of different states where they're doing all kinds of things. They're administering virus tests. They're doing all kinds of mundane tasks like supply chain assistance. There's some factories where workers have been quarantined, and so they're helping to even load trucks in some cases. But they keep saying, the National Guard keeps saying they're not going to be doing any policing or enforcing any lockdown measures. But that's exactly what we've seen them already started to do. Over the weekend, I think you actually sent me this story. In Rhode Island, we have the National Guard. They are working with the police. They were this weekend going around door to door with the cops looking for New Yorkers, looking for people who had been to New York recently. Because New York, especially New York City, is the worst hit place in the U.S. for the virus. And so I think they were trying to send people back to New York and keep them in this quarantine. And the National Guard was going around with the cops doing this. And in Massachusetts, you also had the National Guard. They've been deployed alongside the police because apparently a lot of cops there are in quarantine. And so they're like filling in the National Guard there in Massachusetts. So I think we're probably going to see more of this presence on American streets. On Friday, Trump had signed this executive order that authorizes the Pentagon and the DHS to call up 1 million National Guardsmen. And also troops from the Ready Reserves, which I think actually comes from all the military branches, not just the Guard. And I actually had thought that it was illegal, like it was supposed to be illegal to deploy any soldiers other than the National Guard and the Coast Guard in the U.S. The whole posse comitatus thing. But I guess they can just do whatever they want with this emergency, with the crisis that's going on right now. And I guess one of the last things I'll say here is like, one of the most worrying things I've seen lately are these video clips showing where you can see hundreds and hundreds of these military vehicles being carted around the country on freight trains. And in some cases, it looks like they're sending them into like major cities like Chicago and San Francisco. And these are not just, flatbed trucks and Humvees and stuff. We're talking like armored vehicles, armored personnel carriers, tanks, like serious weapons of war, and gigantic, endless lines of these things being, hauled around all at once in the U.S. And I've seen some officials dismissing this, like dismissing any concerns about this, saying, oh, it's just routine movements. And, maybe that's all it is. But I'm still kind of suspicious. Like, I still think some of this could be for the coronavirus response. And I think that's really worrying, seeing all the vehicles they're carting around right now.
Well, I think that's a good frame of mind to have right now, is to be suspicious of what the U.S. government is doing. Because we know what they say is, this isn't what we're doing. It's not this authoritarian overreach. We're just taking a very measured and public health focused response to the coronavirus. These are the things that you'll hear. But like so many other times in the history, they're actually, seizing a lot of power and doing a lot behind the scenes. So, after 9/11, they say, we need to do more surveillance to keep Americans safe, but it's not, going to be spying on every American citizen. And in fact, you had Clapper, who was director of the CIA at the time, or was he DNI at the time, who said that, there was no mass surveillance program, and there was one going on. And so we should be vigilant and skeptical, about what they say the military is doing versus what they're actually doing. But at the same time, just because you see this video of some armored cars moving around, that doesn't necessarily mean that the revolution is on and grab your AR and get ready to fight. But this is a very serious situation. So I guess do we have any idea on So what I've noticed about this is like this is all just happening, and hardly anybody is trying to say no. And if anybody does try to say no, they're just mocked and smeared by the establishment. I mean, this was very clear what happened to Thomas Massey on an unrelated issue, but with the a bailout, just asking for a voice vote. Merely like trying to go by a standard procedure at a time like this is apparently too drastic and interfering of a thing to ask. And so he was, attacked by the president and John Kerry. Imagine that. And so I guess, do you see any point where people are going to like stop and say like, oh, like, do you really have the authority to do that? I'm sure most Americans are going to say posse comma who, and not really understand at all what that means. And also, we've already seen under the Trump administration that this has come definitely into question with the enforcement at the southern border, right? Where you've had U.S. troops deployed down there, military police, to do like some immigration work. And, that sure seems like, policing on American soil. So when are people going to start questioning anything here?
Yeah, unfortunately, I think it's hard to say. I mean, with this health crisis we have, the whole global pandemic thing, that's a pretty good like excuse for, those in power to just shut down any criticism. Like, oh no, this is an emergency. We have to deploy the military in the streets. We have to, do all these things. And I've seen certainly like some people in the media, some like dismissal of any concern about these military vehicles that, oh, that's just like conspiracy theorizing. And I think certainly some people are kind of going a little overboard, saying that, oh, yeah, this is the boogaloo, and that, like, they're going to try to institute martial law, like it's tomorrow, it's coming. like I can't speak with that kind of certainty. I'm not sure exactly what's in store here. Is the National Guard just going to continue administering virus tests and like helping with supply chain? Or are we going to see something like we saw after Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans, where they're policing the streets with M16s slung around their shoulders? Like that's I think that's certainly possible. I don't think concern about that itself should be dismissed as like, conspiracy theory. I think it's very likely that's going to happen. But in terms of like when will there be backlash to this? Like, unfortunately, I think it's probably just going to be a like pretty vocal minority of people, a minority, I should say, who might raise any issue about this. Otherwise, though, I think people are going to be largely cowed by the fact that there's a pandemic and that people are going to sort of like think there's no room to complain when there's an emergency like this.
Well, I guess we're still continuing to really see like certainly this is a pandemic. It's disruptive. It's killing a significant number of people. I think the global death toll is now over 30,000, and the U.S. death toll is well over 1,000. But I guess at the same time, well, I don't know. Do you have anything to say about what kind of the status of the virus is in the U.S. or is there any kind of metric or data that you're looking at or looking for? People say we're 2 weeks behind Italy. This is where we are compared to France and Spain and Japan. Is there anything that you found that's either helpful to look at, or do you have anything that you've seen that gives you an indication as to where the U.S. is in this whole coronavirus pandemic?
Well, yeah, I would definitely suggest people look at the, and this is a pretty common tool that, it's a well-known tool, but the Johns Hopkins University has this tracker where it compiles all this data, all the official data from countries, and they've now have it in the U.S. where they break it down by county, so you can see like where which counties are worse. But one of the more like useful tools of the Johns Hopkins tracker is that it collates all the data into a graph, so you can see like the daily increase. And you can see it on a logarithmic scale, so you can see how much it's been multiplying. And I think it is useful to look at sort of the daily increase and stuff. And unfortunately, I tend to think that based on that we have not reached the peak of this virus in the United States yet, that I think it's still on the upward side. Like we're not really seeing like the deluge of new cases slow down. And so like we might still see the worst of this yet, unfortunately. Now, another thing, too, that to consider is that some of this data is coming in a little bit late because there was like a backlog of tests. So like some of the data that's being added to the whole pool of data right now, that might sort of be misleading in terms of like, the recent cases. And so maybe the data I'm seeing is actually a snapshot of 2 weeks ago. And so, maybe we are starting to get close to the peak of this. But in terms of like the graphs, if you look at these graphs, it does look like we're still on the upward end of this. And so I think that's unfortunate. Right now, I think there's like over 140,000 cases in the U.S. and we're seeing like at least 10,000 new cases every single day. And so like that, that puts you on track to start doubling your cases pretty quickly. I think recently worldwide, we've been seeing more than 60,000 cases per day. So pretty soon here, we're going to start seeing 100,000 cases per day. And then, this thing really starts multiplying. But
now.
Oh, go ahead.
I just have noticed that it seems like there's a lot more testing going on now, and some people are saying that does account for some of the increase, and making it look like it's increasing so fast. You talked about the backlog of tests, but just like there's so many more tests that are happening now. At one point, it was nearly impossible for anybody in the U.S. to get tested, and now it seems like they have drive-through testing in several states.
Yeah, that is absolutely true. That like the data you're seeing is just a matter of how many people have been confirmed through tests. And so when they confirm them, like it doesn't give you always a good idea of like how fast the virus is growing, because like I said, some of these tests could be from a week ago. You're not necessarily seeing like every single case. Like I don't know, like it can be kind of misleading to look at this data. However, at the same time, though, the fact that they're finding this thing in so many communities and so many counties and stuff, I think that is indicative that it's spreading and that we had some health officials saying that the spread in the U.S. is accelerating still. Like it's still, is yet to hit its peak. And so, yes, it is partially true that like we are seeing like more testing is being done. So, of course, they're just finding more of it because they're now looking for it. But the fact that they're finding so much is also, I think, like an illustration that like it is spreading here. There's a pretty significant outbreak here in the U.S. I think, let me see here. I have the data right in front of me. The top states right now, New York by far is the worst hit state. They have like 60,000 cases. But then behind them, you have New Jersey, California, and then unfortunately Michigan, where I am. Like those are some of the top places that each have more than 5,000 cases. And so we are seeing too spread from the coasts into some like more of like flyover country of the U.S. Like you can see all these dots and blotches on the map in Middle America now. And so it's now spread from some of the major population centers into just like random communities and all over the country, it looks like.
Maybe the last thing we talk about today, Will, is just with all this going on with the coronavirus, it doesn't seem that the Hots and the Trump administration are content to just let like the foreign policy stuff go by on the back burner and seem interested in actively interfering and keeping up with these regime change operations. And so I was just worried. I want to talk about more from the U.S. side rather than like what's happening in Venezuela and Iran on today's show. But just with all the troop movements and everything, does it seem particularly dangerous or foolish to try to maybe mobilize U.S. forces and, expect to be able to put 10,000 people on aircraft carrier or put 10,000 people in a base or, however many hundreds of thousands of troops you're going to need, let's say if you want to invade Iran? Does it seem like there's any consideration in the like kind of war making side of the U.S. foreign policy for that? We kind of had to put some stuff on delay because of the coronavirus, not doing the right thing and removing the sanctions so the people of Venezuela and Iran could eat. I know that's what should happen, but I'm just saying, like, is there a practical reason on the U.S. side to not be, incredibly unnecessary warmongers for the next 6 months?
I mean, certainly objectively, there are great reasons to hold off on any kind of major military operations. I mean, as we've been seeing with the exercises and some of the troop movements and stuff, this stuff has been delayed and there's severe disruptions to the operations of the military. But Scott Ritter actually had a great op-ed at RT the other day talking about how militaries are like uniquely vulnerable to pandemics and outbreaks. Just because of the nature of, you have to put all these guys in one, area. You have to keep them all in very close quarters. And so, the spread of disease is very easy among the military. And so they would be particularly vulnerable right now to this kind of thing. And so, yes, I do think that is in the thinking, at least, of some of the military planners. And we can see that by the fact that they've ordered halts on troop movements and restricted access to bases and all kinds of stuff like this. Now, in terms of the most hawkish, voices within the administration and stuff, I'm not sure if they're going to be deterred by this virus. We've certainly seen, things like sanctions have not been put on hold at all. Like they're not having any humanitarian considerations. And obviously levying sanctions doesn't really involve like large movements of people. And so, they're certainly willing to continue doing things like that. But yeah, I do think that like the virus has put a halt on some, operations on movements and how bases operate. And yeah, I definitely think that this has had an effect.
Yeah, just another thing I was thinking of, and then after I say this, you respond however you want, and then let people know where to find your work, Will. But was that with the obviously we know what we need to reduce the number of deaths to whatever level possible for the coronavirus, and that's the protective gear and ventilators. Ventilators are kind of the two critical things, and I guess test kits as well. Well, if you have U.S. troops deployed, 200,000 deployed abroad to who knows how many, bases in 100-something countries, it seems like you're going to need a disproportionate number of ventilators in all those places, or you're going to be putting the troops at, a risk of dying very quickly of the coronavirus, because, the outbreaks seem, with the way the barracks are set up, like they would likely be very acute and, very one at a time. And so you're going to need several ventilators there to, support anybody who needs it. And then you're taking all those resources away from other places. And so if you did, want to prepare an invasion force for Iran, you're going to have to take thousands and thousands of ventilators out of the U.S. that could be saving American citizens and send it overseas to possibly be destroyed. But who the hell knows what in the case that we actually invade Iran. So I don't know. Whatever you got to end this with, Will.
Sure. I mean, yeah, definitely like any kind of major mobilization effort for any kind of war or military operation that would just inherently put a massive strain on the already completely depleted supply of things like, personal protective gear, which is needed like in all kinds of medical settings. It's not like face shields and face masks and bodies and like surgical suits and protective gear like that. It's not really specific to viruses. That's like a lot of medical things require that. But then also, yeah, in the event of an actual viral outbreak, you need things like ventilators and all kinds of other specific gear. I'm not really sure how it breaks down, like how the U.S. would prioritize that. Like, if there was a major outbreak at a foreign military base, I'm not sure if they would be treated within the military healthcare system or if they would be treated at the local, soldiers like stationed in Germany or something. I'm not sure if they'd be treated in the German hospital system. I'm not totally sure how that would work. But certainly, yeah, it would put a massive strain on, an already very strained supply of all this equipment, ventilators and protective gear. So I certainly would like to see them not launch any major military operations for the duration of this crisis, and then also after it too. But definitely during it, that would be a disaster. So in terms of where you can find my stuff, you can find my writing at the Libertarian Institute, a few at antiwar.com, Consortium News. I'm a staff writer at RT, so that's mostly where you're going to be finding me. And to see what I'm writing, you can go to my Twitter page, WKP ANCAP, to see that, and also my Facebook page where I'm just Will Porter. I share everything I write there, and yeah, that's where you can find me.
Yeah, well, the Will Porter, your Facebook page is one of my stops in the morning to check out what you wrote the night before, as I'm putting together my news roundup that's at the Libertarian Institute in the mornings, and then that's where you will find this show. Hopefully y'all can take the time to share it and promote mine and Will's work. We really appreciate it, and be back again next week. Thanks, Will.
Thanks, Cal.